Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. David Chen had cataloged 17 species of fungi along the Knife Lake portage before he noticed the teeth marks. They weren't the gouges of a black bear stripping bark, nor the neat chisel work of beavers. These were human dental impressions pressed deep into the white flesh of a paper birch. The wood around them darkened with something that looked disturbingly like dried saliva. David crouched beside the tree, his Bushnell rangefinder dangling forgotten from his neck as he traced the marks with a gloved finger. The indentations were desperate, frantic. Molars grinding against cambium as though trying to extract nutrition from cellulose itself. He photographed the damage with his department-issued Nikon, the shutter sound unnaturally loud in the September stillness. The boundary waters stretched around him in every direction. 1 million acres of interconnected lakes and boreal forest straddling the Minnesota-Ontario border. David had spent 5 years as a ranger in this wilderness, and he'd learned to read its language. The scratchings of lynx, the territorial markings of wolves, the industrial determination of porcupines. This was something else entirely. His radio crackled. "Chen, you copy?" David thumbed the transmit button on his Motorola. "Go ahead, Tom. Just checking your 20. You're supposed to be back at Prairie Portage by 1600. David glanced at his watch. A reliable Timex expedition, not the smartwatches some of the younger rangers had started wearing. 1342 hours. I'm on schedule. Found something odd on the Knife Lake Trail, though. Bite marks on a birch. Human bite marks. Static filled the pause before Tom Reeves, the district ranger, responded. "You sure? I've got dental impressions in stereo, Tom. Upper and lower. Unless we've got a bear that's been to an orthodontist." David kept his tone light, but his stomach had developed a cold, tight feeling that had nothing to do with the granola bar he'd eaten for lunch. "Mark the coordinates. We'll document it properly when you get back." Tom's voice carried a weight David couldn't quite identify. "And Chen? Don't linger out there. Weather Service is calling for an early cold front tonight." David acknowledged and clipped the radio back to his belt. The sky above the forest canopy was that deep, crystalline blue that Minnesota perfected in autumn, not a cloud visible through the gaps in the pine and spruce. But Tom Reeves had been working these woods for 23 years. If he said weather was coming, weather was coming. David continued his survey, but the tooth marks had planted a seed of unease that sprouted with each step. He was a scientist by training. His bachelor's in biology from the University of Minnesota had emphasized empirical observation and logical deduction. The natural world operated according to rules, patterns that could be understood and predicted. Human teeth marks in trees didn't fit any pattern he recognized. By the time he reached the Prairie Portage station, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western tree line, painting the underside of clouds that had materialized with disturbing speed. Tom was waiting on the dock, his weathered face drawn into lines of concern that went deeper than worry about an incoming storm. "Come inside," Tom said. "We need to talk." The ranger station was a modest structure of varnished pine, its interior dominated by topographic maps and a wall of radio equipment. Tom poured coffee from a percolator that had been brewing since morning, the liquid thick enough to qualify as a biological weapon. He didn't speak until they were both seated at the worn wooden table that served as desk, dining surface, and war room. "Rachel Morrison," Tom said finally. "You remember her?" David did. The woman had stopped by the station 4 weeks ago to obtain a backcountry permit. Late 20s, dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, expensive North Face gear that still had that right out of REI stiffness. She'd been polite but distracted, her permit application listing her purpose as cultural research. She was doing something with Native American traditions, David said. Interviewing elders, I think. Documenting oral histories for her dissertation. Tom pulled a file from his desk drawer. Anthropology PhD candidate from the University of Wisconsin. She was specifically interested in traditional Ojibwe beliefs about the boundary waters. He opened the file, revealing a copy of Rachel's permit, a photocopy of her driver's license, and several photographs. She was supposed to exit at Lake 1 4 days ago, never showed up. David's coffee suddenly tasted like ash. When did we start the search? Day before yesterday. We've had 3 teams working a grid pattern from her last known position at Lac La Croix. Found her campsite on an island in the northern section. Tent still standing, most of her gear intact, but no Rachel. Tom's finger tapped a photograph showing a scattered campsite, a blue tent with its door hanging open. And David, we found something else. He slid another photograph across the table. It showed a tree trunk, the bark stripped away in long, vertical tiers. In the exposed wood, someone had carved symbols, angular, harsh lines that hurt David's eyes to look at. The guys who found this called in a cultural liaison from the Red Lake Band, Tom continued. Elder named Mary Kingfisher. She took one look at the symbols and refused to translate them. Said only that Rachel had been asking questions about things that shouldn't be spoken of, especially not out here in the old places. That's not helpful. No, Tom agreed, but Mary did say something else before she left. She said that Rachel wasn't the first. David set down his coffee cup very carefully. The first what? Tom opened another file, this one containing incident reports dating back 18 months. 3 other people, all disappeared in the boundary waters between March 2014 and now. Different entry points, different times of year, but all of them with connections to researching indigenous traditions in the area. He laid out the reports like tarot cards revealing a grim fortune. James Whitmore, amateur ethnographer, vanished June 2014. Miranda Soto, folklore graduate student, gone November 2014. Kevin Parr, documentary filmmaker, February 2015. We found gear, we found campsites, but the people? It's like they walked into the trees and ceased to exist. David felt his analytical mind engaging, grateful for the familiar comfort of pattern recognition. 4 disappearances, all researchers. That suggests someone who doesn't want these traditions documented. A person, Tom. Maybe someone from the reservation who thinks these outsiders are violating sacred knowledge? Tom shook his head. That was my first thought too. The FBI looked into it. No evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle at any of the sites. Just absence. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking. Mary Kingfisher said something else. She said that the old stories exist as warnings, not entertainment, and when you invite certain things by speaking their names in the places where they still listen, those things might answer. You're talking about superstition. I'm talking about 4 missing people and an entire community of indigenous elders who won't set foot in certain parts of these woods. Tom's eyes were steady. You're a scientist, David. So am I, in my way. But we work in a place where cell phones don't function, where a person can be 3 miles from help and might as well be on another planet. Rational explanations don't always account for everything we see out here. David wanted to argue, but his mind kept returning to those teeth marks in the birch bark, the desperate grinding pressure required to leave impressions in living wood, the location, miles from any marked trail in a section of forest where even experienced outdoorsmen rarely ventured. What do you want me to do? He asked. Tom pulled out a map, the topographic lines showing the complex maze of lakes and portages that made up this section of the boundary waters. Rachel's research notes were in her tent. She'd been documenting stories about something called a Wendigo. Wendigo, David corrected automatically. Wendigo. It's an Algonquian mythology figure, a spirit associated with winter, famine, and cannibalism. Right. Well, according to her notes, she'd been following a chain of stories all pointing to a specific area. Tom's finger traced a route on the map, heading north from Lac La Croix toward the Canadian border. There's an island here in the middle of Agnes Lake. No official name on the charts, but Rachel wrote that the Ojibwe call it Wendigo Minis, Wendigo Island. She had planned to visit it as the final stop in her research. And you want me to go there? I want you to lead a search team there. Tom clarified. 2 other rangers, proper SAR protocols, emergency beacon, the whole 9 yards. But David, I need someone who can look at this with a clear head. Someone who won't get spooked by shadows and stories. He paused. I'm not saying I believe in monsters. I'm saying something is happening out there, and I need rational explanations before this turns into a media circus with conspiracy theorists crawling all over the boundary waters. David studied the map. Agnes Lake was remote even by boundary water standards, a solid 2-day paddle from the nearest road access, surrounded by terrain that became progressively more difficult to navigate. If Rachel had made it that far and something had happened, the isolation would have been absolute. When do we leave? David asked. Dawn tomorrow. I'll brief the rest of the team tonight. Tom stood, signaling the conversation's end. Get some rest. And David? Pack warm clothes? That cold front I mentioned? It's coming in harder than forecasted. They're talking temperature drops of 30 degrees by tomorrow night. David nodded and headed for the door, but Tom's voice stopped him. One more thing. Those tooth marks you found today? I want you to show me exactly where tomorrow before we head north. Why? Tom's expression was grim. Because Knife Lake is directly south of Agnes Lake. And if someone or something is moving between them, I need to know the route. David's cabin was a 1/4 mile from the main station, a small structure he'd renovated himself over 5 Minnesota winters. He lit the propane heater, boiled water for freeze-dried stroganoff, and spread Rachel Morrison's research notes across his kitchen table while he ate. She'd been thorough. The notes spanned 2 spiral-bound notebooks filled with neat handwriting, sketches of symbols, and transcriptions of interviews. David read them chronologically, watching Rachel's academic interest gradually transform into something approaching obsession. The early entries were standard anthropological documentation, variations of the Wendigo myth across different Algonquian peoples, comparative analysis with European werewolf legends, psychological interpretations of the Wendigo psychosis that had been documented among isolated northern communities. Rachel approached the subject with scholarly detachment, noting discrepancies between sources and questioning the reliability of second-hand accounts. But around the middle of the second notebook, the tone shifted. August 12, 2015. Met with Joseph Kingfisher, Mary's husband, at his home in Red Lake. He was reluctant to speak at first, but eventually shared a story his grandfather told him. The elder had been a trapper in the boundary waters in the 1940s. During an unusually harsh winter, he and his partner were stranded for 3 weeks by a blizzard. When the weather cleared and other trappers reached their cabin, they found only the elder, alive but emaciated despite the cabin being full of preserved food. The partner was never found. The elder refused to eat for days after his rescue, and when he finally did, he vomited immediately. He spent his last years warning anyone who would listen. The hunger is not in your stomach. It lives in your chest, where your heart should be. And once it speaks to you in the silence, you will never be full again. Joseph wouldn't elaborate on what he thought had happened to the partner, but he kept returning to one phrase. Wendigo kawin. The act of becoming Wendigo. David set down his fork, no longer hungry. He flipped forward through the notes. August 19th. Researched Wendigo Cowan in university archives. Found several ethnographic accounts from 19th and early 20th centuries describing execution rituals performed by Cree and Ojibwe communities. The accused were typically individuals who had survived periods of extreme famine in circumstances where others had died. Common symptoms included insatiable hunger despite eating, feeling intensely cold even in warm weather, claims of hearing voices speaking in unknown languages, violent ideation, and in extreme cases, actual acts of cannibalism. Traditional response was execution by fire or boiling, as normal methods of killing were believed ineffective. Psychological literature dismisses this as a culture-bound syndrome, a form of psychosis triggered by starvation and isolation. But the consistency of symptoms across centuries and vast geographical distances is remarkable. These accounts come from communities with no contact with each other, yet they describe virtually identical progressions. Question: if this is purely psychological, Why do the myths insist that Wendigo can be created by consuming human flesh even once, even without starvation? Why the emphasis on a spiritual transformation rather than simple madness? Rachel's academic voice was fraying at the edges. The later entries grew more fragmented, less concerned with citations and more focused on primary sources she'd convinced to speak with her. September 2nd. Found reference to Wendigo Minis, Wendigo Island, in Fur Trade Journal dated 1823. French voyageur named Baptiste Leclerc wrote that his Ojibwe guides refused to camp on l'Île Maudite, the cursed island, in Agnes Lake. They claimed it was a place where the boundary between physical hunger and spiritual hunger had worn thin, where the Wendigo had taken root in the stones themselves. Leclerc thought this was superstition until one of his men, a French-Canadian named Moreau, went ashore to hunt. Moreau returned 3 hours later having caught nothing, but refused to speak about what he'd seen. That night, he stole all the expedition's pemmican and fled into the forest. His body was found 2 weeks later, partially consumed. The Ojibwe guide said it wasn't bears. The teeth marks were wrong. David's hands had gone cold despite the cabin's warmth. He forced himself to continue reading. September 7th. Mary Kingfisher finally agreed to speak with me, but only in her home, and only after I swore I wasn't planning to visit Wendigo Minis. I lied. She's the first person to explain what the island actually is. According to oral tradition passed through her family, it's a place where the Anishinaabe performed banishment rituals in the old days, long before Europeans arrived. When someone showed signs of Wendigo Kawin, when the hunger had begun to change them, they would be taken to the island and left there with no tools, no food, no means of escape. The idea was that isolation would either starve the Wendigo spirit and free the person, or complete the transformation in a place where it couldn't spread to the community. Mary said her great-grandmother claimed you can still hear them there. The ones who never died, never became fully Wendigo, but were trapped in between, neither human enough to die of starvation, nor spirit enough to transcend physical needs. Just endlessly hungry. She begged me not to go there. Said that the island remembers. Said that anyone who spends a night there will carry something back, even if they don't realize it. The Wendigo doesn't always look like the stories say, she told me. Sometimes it looks like you, sounds like you, thinks with your thoughts, until one day you realize the person you were has become the thing you're feeding. The final entry was dated September 11th, 2 days before Rachel was supposed to exit the boundary waters. I'm leaving for Wendigo Minis tomorrow. I know Mary would be disappointed, but I've come too far to turn back based on folklore. I need to see the island for myself. Document any physical evidence of these historical banishment rituals. If I can find artifacts, petroglyphs, burial sites, anything, it would be the archaeological corroboration that's missing from the ethnographic record. Though I'll admit, I've been having the strangest dreams lately. Always the same. I'm standing in a forest clearing and I'm so hungry I can feel my organs consuming themselves. There's something moving in the trees around me, circling, but I can't see what it is. I can only hear it breathing, except the breathing sounds like wind through empty ribs. And I know, in the dream logic way you know things, that if I can just catch it and eat it, the hunger will stop. I wake up ravenous every time. Yesterday I ate an entire day's worth of trail rations at 3 a.m. and still felt empty. It's probably just anxiety about the expedition, the mind playing tricks. I'm a scientist, for God's sake. I don't believe in spiritual possession, but Mary's last words to me keep echoing. The Wendigo doesn't possess you. It reveals what you already were. We're all hungry, Rachel. That's the human condition. The Wendigo just makes you honest about it. The notebook ended there. David sat in his cabin as darkness filled the windows, staring at Rachel's handwriting. The propane heater clicked and hummed, but he felt cold, a chill that seemed to originate from somewhere behind his sternum rather than the air around him. His dinner sat half-eaten on the plate. He should finish it. Waste was irrational and he had a long day ahead tomorrow, but when he looked at the cooling stroganoff, his stomach clenched with something that wasn't quite nausea. Outside, the wind was beginning to rise. The search team assembled at dawn beneath a sky the color of old bruises. David, Tom, and 2 other rangers, Jennifer Wu and Marcus Bradford, loaded 3 canoes with gear, supplies, and enough emergency equipment to handle a week in the backcountry if necessary. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight, and David's breath came in visible plumes as he secured the waterproof cases containing GPS units, satellite phones, and first aid supplies. "Radio check," Tom said, and they each confirmed their handheld Motorola's were functioning on the designated frequency. "Cell phones won't work past Knife Lake, and even the sat phone gets dicey with the canopy cover. We stick together, we follow protocols, and nobody goes off alone. Clear?" They nodded. Marcus, a broad-shouldered former Marine with a decade of SAR experience, helped David lift the last canoe into the water. "You really think we're going to find her alive?" David considered the question. Statistically, survival rates in wilderness searches dropped precipitously after 72 hours. Rachel had been missing for 96. The overnight cold would have accelerated hypothermia risk. Without shelter and supplies, even an experienced outdoors person would struggle. "I think we'll find answers," David said, which wasn't a lie. They paddled north, following the chain of lakes and portages that stitched together the aquatic highway into the deep boundary waters. The forest pressed close on either side, a mixture of pine, spruce, birch, and aspen that created walls of vegetation so dense that the spaces between trees looked like entrances to nowhere. David kept his eyes on the water, on the rhythmic dip and pull of his paddle, on the flex of Jennifer's shoulders in the canoe ahead. Don't think about the dreams. He'd had them too last night. The same hungry darkness Rachel had described. Coincidence? Suggestion? The human mind was susceptible to narrative, especially when primed with detailed accounts from someone else. There was nothing supernatural about shared imagery. They reached Knife Lake by mid-morning. David guided them to the portage where he'd found the tooth marks the day before. The birch tree looked worse in daylight. The exposed wood had darkened further, and there was a smell around it that reminded David of infected tissue, sweet and wrong. Tom photographed the damage from multiple angles while Marcus examined the surrounding area. The big man moved through the underbrush with surprising quiet, reading the forest floor the way David read scientific papers. "Got tracks here," Marcus called. "Human, barefoot." They gathered around the prints pressed into the soft earth beside a small stream. The feet had been large, men's size 11 or 12, but the gait was wrong. The stride length was too long, the depth uneven, as though the person walking had been lurching rather than maintaining steady movement. "They lead north," Marcus said, pointing toward the denser forest. "Toward Agnes Lake." "Same direction we're headed," Jennifer murmured. She was the newest member of the team, 26 and brilliant with the technical equipment, but still learning to trust her instincts in the wilderness. Could it be Rachel? "Wrong size," David said. Her driver's license listed her at 5'6". These prints suggest someone over 6 feet tall. "So there's someone else out here." Tom stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "Question is whether they're connected to the disappearances or just another lost hiker." David thought about the desperate quality of the tooth marks, the uneven gait. "We should follow the tracks." Tom shook his head. "We stick to the plan. Agnes Lake is our objective. If these tracks parallel our route, we'll keep an eye out. But I'm not chasing shadows through the forest." They continued north, but the tracks shadowed them. Every portage, every landing, David found them. Barefoot impressions that grew increasingly erratic, as though the person making them was losing coordination. At one portage, Marcus found where the individual had fallen, the soil torn up by scrabbling hands. And at another they found a piece of fabric, the remains of what had once been a shirt, now shredded and stained with substances David didn't want to identify. The temperature continued to drop as they paddled. By early afternoon, their breath was fogging in front of them despite the moderate exertion, and ice had begun forming at the edges of the lakes where the water lay still. David checked his thermometer. 41 degrees. The forecast had called for a high of 65. "This isn't right," Jennifer said, her voice tight. This kind of temperature inversion, this quickly, it's meteorologically anomalous. Weather in the boundary waters has its own rules, Tom replied, but even he looked unsettled. We're in a microclimate. Happens sometimes. They made camp that night on a small island in Lac La Croix, within sight of the larger landmass where Rachel's tent had been found. Tom insisted on a fire, both for warmth and morale, and they huddled around it as darkness fell with unnerving speed. The flames cast their faces in flickering orange, making them look like actors in some aboriginal shadow play. David volunteered for the first watch. He sat with his back to a white pine, watching the fire burn down to coals while the others slept in their tents. The forest around them was absolutely silent. No owl calls, no rustle of nocturnal animals, no wind in the branches. Just the quiet crackle of dying embers and the sound of his own breathing. He was checking his watch, 0237 hours, time to wake Marcus for the next shift, when he heard it. Footsteps, bare feet on stone, moving with that same lurching, uncoordinated gait the tracks had suggested. They circled the camp at a distance of perhaps 50 yards, never coming closer but never receding either. Just walking, pacing, circling. David stood, grabbing his flashlight and thumbing it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and underbrush and nothing else. The footsteps stopped. "Hello?" David called, his voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. "This is the National Park Service. If you're lost or injured, we can help you." No response. But in the silence, David became aware of something else. The sound of breathing. Heavy, labored, as though the person standing in the darkness was struggling to draw air into damaged lungs, or through a throat distorted by, disease? Injury? Hunger? The thought came unbidden, and with it a sympathetic clench in David's own stomach. When had he last eaten? The sandwich at lunch felt like days ago. He should wake the others, should make sure everyone was safe and accounted for, but first he needed to address this gnawing emptiness in his abdomen. David's hand moved toward his pack where the trail rations were stored, then stopped. He'd eaten 3 hours ago. He couldn't possibly be hungry. This was psychological, a response to stress and Rachel's descriptions of Wendigo symptoms. He was letting folklore influence his physiological perceptions. The breathing in the darkness grew louder, closer, though David's flashlight revealed nothing but trees and shadows. And underlying the respiratory sounds was something else. A voice, maybe, or many voices, whispering in a language that predated English, predated French, predated anything David recognized. The words writhed at the edge of comprehension, almost forming meaning before dissolving back into incomprehensible susurration. One phrase, though, kept repeating. 3 syllables that David's mind translated against his will. So hungry, so hungry, so hungry. "Wake up!" David shouted, and the spell, if that's what it had been, shattered. Marcus burst from his tent, Jennifer and Tom close behind, all of them armed with flashlights and Marcus carrying a service pistol, despite regulations discouraging firearms in the backcountry. "What happened?" Tom demanded. David swept his light across the tree line again. Still nothing. Someone was out there, circling the camp, barefoot. They searched the perimeter together, but found no tracks in the frost-hardened ground. No evidence anyone had been there at all. Tom gave David a long, evaluating look that David recognized, the assessment of whether a team member was becoming compromised by stress and isolation. "I heard it," David insisted. "Footsteps, breathing." "I believe you," Tom said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But there's nothing here now. We should all try to get some rest. Long day tomorrow." They returned to their tents, but David didn't sleep. He lay in his thermal sleeping bag, listening to the silence and trying to ignore the hollow feeling in his chest that had nothing to do with calories consumed or energy expended. Rachel's words echoed in his memory. "The hunger is not in your stomach. It lives in your chest, where your heart should be." Outside, something that might have been wind and might have been breathing moved through the trees. They found Rachel's campsite in the gray light of dawn. The tent sagged between its supports, the blue nylon dark with moisture. Her gear lay scattered, a backpack with its contents spilled across the ground, a camp stove still attached to a fuel canister, a waterproof bag containing her camera and laptop. Everything you'd expect from an interrupted departure, except the interruption had apparently come from inside the tent, rather than out. The interior showed signs of struggle. The sleeping bag was shredded, not cut but torn, as though something with tremendous strength had ripped through the fabric. The tent's mesh walls bore long tiers, the edges ragged, and on the nylon floor, written in what David desperately hoped was mud, were symbols matching those Rachel had photographed and sketched in her notebook. "Don't touch anything," Tom said, though none of them had moved toward the tent. They stood in a loose circle, staring at the ruin of Rachel Morrison's final camp. Jennifer broke the silence. "There's no blood." She was right. Despite the violence implied by the shredded gear, there was no blood spatter, no drag marks, no evidence of injury. Just destruction and those angular symbols that seemed to writhe when David looked at them directly. Marcus photographed everything, methodical and professional, while David circled the camp's perimeter looking for tracks. He found them 20 yards into the forest. The same barefoot prints they'd been following, but smaller now. Women's size 8, Rachel's size. The prints led north toward Agnes Lake, toward Windigo Minis. She walked away, David said, and heard the bewilderment in his own voice. In the middle of the night, barefoot, in temperatures approaching freezing, she walked away from her shelter and supplies and headed deeper into the wilderness. "That doesn't make sense," Jennifer said. Even in a state of panic, survival instinct would prevent, unless she wasn't in a state of panic. Tom's face had gone gray. Unless she was going towards something rather than away from it. They followed the tracks. David documented the route with GPS coordinates, creating a digital breadcrumb trail that would be useless if their equipment failed, but provided the illusion of control. The tracks led them through increasingly difficult terrain, over ridges of exposed granite, through marshes where the water had frozen in strange, jagged patterns, across streams that should have been flowing but lay motionless and thick. The cold intensified with each mile. David's thermometer read 32 degrees, then 28, then 24. Impossible for late September, even this far north. His breath came in clouds so dense they obscured his vision, and ice had begun forming on his beard. They reached Agnes Lake in early afternoon. It was smaller than the maps suggested, perhaps 3/4 of a mile across, surrounded by walls of pine and spruce that seemed to lean inward like spectators at an execution. The water was dark, not the clear reflective surface of most Boundary Waters lakes, but a deep charcoal color that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. In the center of the lake, perhaps 400 yards from shore, rose the island. Windigo Minis was barely an island at all, more an outcropping of granite thrust up from the lake bottom, no more than 2 acres of rock and scraggly vegetation. Trees grew there, but they were twisted things, their trunks bent at unnatural angles, their branches bare despite the season. And even from this distance, David could see something white scattered across the stone surface. "Are those bones?" Jennifer whispered. Tom raised his binoculars, adjusted the focus, then lowered them slowly. His expression had gone carefully blank, the look of someone refusing to process what they'd just seen. "Could be deer or other things." "Rachel's tracks lead to the shore," Marcus reported. He was crouched at the lake's edge, examining the ground. "But there's no canoe here. No sign of how she crossed." "She swam," David heard himself say, though the idea was insane. The water temperature would have been lethal. Even a strong swimmer couldn't have made it more than a few dozen yards before hypothermia shut down motor function. But the tracks stopped at the water's edge, and on the island's shore, David could see them through his own binoculars. They began again. "We need to get over there," Tom said. "We'll paddle across, conduct a thorough search, and radio for helicopter extraction if we find Rachel. In and out before dark." They launched 2 canoes, leaving one on shore as backup. David paired with Tom, Jennifer with Marcus. The paddles cut into water that felt somehow denser than normal, viscous and resistant. Halfway across, David realized he could no longer see the bottom despite the water's clarity in other Boundary Waters lakes. Just that depthless black, suggesting either tremendous depth or something else. The island grew as they approached, and David's sense of scale recalibrated with disturbing results. What he'd taken for scattered bones were actually everywhere, thousands of them covering much of the exposed granite. They weren't just deer, they were everything. Beaver skulls and bear mandibles and the delicate ribs of fish and the wing bones of eagles and the curving structures of things David couldn't identify. All of them picked clean, bleached white by weather and time. And among them, fresher remains. A moose skull with tissue still clinging to it. The pelvis of something large, wolf, maybe, or lynx. And arranged in a loose circle near the island's center, 5 human skulls. Jesus Christ, Marcus breathed as their canoes ground against the rocky shore. Tom was already on his radio. "Prairie Portage, this is Reeves. We've reached Agnes Lake Island. We have what appears to be human remains, multiple individuals. Request immediate assistance and law enforcement backup." Static answered him. Tom adjusted the frequency, tried again. Nothing but the empty hiss of dead air. "Interference from the terrain," Jennifer suggested, but her voice cracked. She was staring at the bones, her scientific training warring with simple human horror. Or, "Tom, how old do these look to you?" The district ranger approached one of the skulls with visible reluctance. He didn't touch it, but crouched close enough to examine the surface. Years, maybe decades for some of them, but these 3. He indicated the ones furthest from the circle's center. These are newer. Months, maybe. David thought of the missing researchers. James Whitmore, Miranda Soto, Kevin Parr. All vanished in the past 18 months. All last seen in the Boundary Waters. "And Rachel?" he asked. "If she's here, we'll find her." Tom straightened, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol holstered at his belt. "Fan out. Grid search. Nobody goes more than 50 feet from the shore, and stay in visual contact. Marcus with me. Jennifer, David, you two take the western section." They separated, picking their way carefully through the bone field. David's boots crunched on fragments of skeleton with each step, a sound like walking through dried leaves except infinitely worse. Jennifer moved beside him, her face pale, her breath coming in quick, shallow pants that suggested the early stages of panic. "This is a killing ground," she said quietly. "Something hunts here, brings prey back to feed, to store, like a larder." David wanted to correct her, to provide a rational explanation involving natural predation patterns or indigenous burial practices, but the evidence defied rationalization. The bones were too numerous, too varied in species, and the human skulls, arranged in that deliberate circle, suggested intentionality rather than accident. They found Rachel's remaining gear 50 yards into the search, her boots placed neatly side by side on a flat rock, her jacket folded with disturbing care, her pants and shirt arranged as though she'd undressed methodically rather than frantically, and finally her body. She lay in a shallow depression in the granite, naked and curled on her side in a fetal position. Her skin was gray, her eyes open and clouded, her mouth stretched in an expression that David first interpreted as a scream before realizing it was something else. Hunger. Desperate, consuming hunger captured in the moment of death. But that wasn't what made Jennifer sob and turn away, wasn't what made David's analytical mind fracture into static. Rachel had been eating herself. Her fingers were gnawed to the bone, the flesh stripped away with human teeth. Her forearms showed deep bite marks, chunks of muscle torn free. Her abdomen had been opened, not with tools but with fingernails, and tissue pulled out and partially consumed. The ground around her was littered with pieces of herself, a horrible feast that she'd apparently continued until her body simply shut down from trauma and blood loss. "Tom." David's voice was someone else's, distant and hollow. "Tom, we found her." The other 2 rangers arrived at a run, then stopped as abruptly as though they'd hit a physical barrier. Marcus made a sound like a wounded animal. Tom's face went absolutely white. "Radio, he managed. "We need to call this in immediately." But the radios refused to function. Tom tried different frequencies, different positions, even sent Marcus back to the canoes to try from shore. Nothing worked. The satellite phone was equally dead, its screen showing full bars but failing to connect to any network. "We need to leave," Jennifer said. She was shaking, her arms wrapped around herself. "Right now. We document the location, mark it with GPS, and get back to civilization where communications work. This is a recovery operation now, not a search and rescue. We need proper equipment, law enforcement, a medical examiner." She was right. Standard protocol. David knew this, but his eyes were drawn to the 5 skulls in their ceremonial circle, and beyond them to something he'd initially mistaken for another stunted tree. It was a structure. A shelter made from branches and bark and other materials he didn't want to examine too closely, and from inside it came a sound that froze the blood in David's veins. Breathing. "There's someone alive in there," Marcus said, his voice tight with the controlled panic of a trained soldier facing something his training hadn't prepared him for. His hand was on his pistol. "Hello? We're with the Park Service. We're here to help." The breathing continued. Slow, labored, rattling. Not the sound of someone struggling to survive, but of something metabolizing existence at a pace that had nothing to do with human respiration. "We should leave," Jennifer repeated. But Marcus was already moving toward the shelter, his weapon drawn and held in a professional two-handed grip. "Federal Ranger," he announced. "Come out slowly with your hands visible." The breathing stopped. In the sudden silence, David heard his own heartbeat, thunderous and impossibly loud. He heard the lake water lapping against stone. He heard the wind through the bones. And then, from inside the shelter, a voice. So hungry. It was male, the words shaped by a throat that had forgotten how human speech worked. The syllables dragged and clicked, wet and wrong. "So hungry. Why did you come here? Now I have to share." Marcus froze, his training inadequate for the decision tree this presented. "Come out of there now." "Can't." The voice held a note of terrible amusement. "Tried to leave so many times. But the island knows. It knew what I was becoming even before I did. And now I'm part of it. Part of what it remembers, huh?" Tom had his radio out again, clicking through channels with increasing desperation. "We're federal law enforcement officers. You're in a restricted area." "Restricted?" The voice laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Yes, restricted. That's one word for it. The old people had better words. Windigu Kawin, the becoming place, where hunger transforms from need to identity." The shelter began to move, not collapsing or being pushed aside, but changing shape. The materials that composed it rearranging as something emerged from inside, something that had once been human. It stood, barely, on legs that had lost the architecture of normal bipedal locomotion. The joints bent in multiple directions, giving it a lurching, insectile quality. The torso was emaciated beyond possibility, the ribs clearly visible through skin that had gone gray-white like a corpse preserved in peat. The arms were too long, the fingers extended by what looked like exposed bones where fingernails should have been. But the face was worst. It retained enough humanity to be recognizable as a face, eyes, nose, mouth in their proper places. But the proportions were wrong, the mouth stretched too wide, the teeth filed or worn to points. And in the eyes, David saw awareness, intelligence, and an emptiness so profound that looking at it created a sympathetic void in his own chest. "Kevin Parr," Tom breathed, "the documentary filmmaker. You went missing in February." "Went missing?" The thing that had been Kevin echoed. "Such a euphemism. I came here to film a story about Wendigo mythology. Got more authentic than I planned." Those terrible eyes fixed on Tom. "You brought food. How kind." Marcus fired. The report of the pistol was shockingly loud in the confines of the island, and David saw the bullet hit. Center mass. Perfect shot. Kevin's body rocked backward. a hole opening in his chest that should have been lethal. He looked down at the wound, then back up at Marcus. When he smiled, the stretched mouth revealed that every one of his teeth had become carnivorous. "Doesn't work that way," Kevin said. "I'm not alive anymore, not dead either. Something between. Something the old rituals made sure would never leave this place." He took a step forward, that horrible, lurching gait. "But you brought my exit strategy. Fresh bodies. Fresh meat. If I consume you, all of you, I'll have enough strength to swim to shore, to walk away, to finally stop being hungry." David's mind was screaming at him that this violated every principle of biology, physics, and rationality he'd ever learned. Dead tissue didn't move. Bullets killed. Monsters didn't exist. But Rachel's research notes had been clear about one thing. The Wendigo wasn't supernatural. It was a transformation. A corruption of human hunger into something that transcended the physical need for calories and became existential. A state where the act of consumption was the only remaining identity. "Run," Tom said quietly. "Everyone, back to the canoes. Now." They ran. Through the bone field, feet slipping on calcium fragments toward the shore where their canoes waited. Behind them, David heard that lurching gait accelerating, heard Kevin laughing, heard other sounds, movement from other shelters David hadn't noticed, other survivors of the island's transformation. "The skulls!" Jennifer screamed. "The skulls in the circle, they're moving!" David risked a glance back. The 5 skulls were indeed shifting, tilting upward as though reanimated by some force that had nothing to do with muscles or nerves. And from the empty eye sockets, that same horrible awareness stared out. Not ghosts, not spirits. Something worse. Consciousness without death, hunger without end. Existence stretched into an eternal present where the only constant was need. They reached the canoes. Marcus and Jennifer tumbled into one, Tom and David into the other. They pushed off from shore with desperate strength, paddles biting into dark water. The things on the island didn't follow. They gathered at the shore, Kevin and at least 3 others in various stages of transformation, plus those animated skulls dragging themselves forward on exposed neck vertebrae. They stood and watched and called out in voices that were no longer human. "Come back, just one of you. Just let me taste. Just let me be full for a moment. Please." The words followed the canoes across the water, growing fainter but never quite disappearing. Even when they reached the far shore, even when they hauled the canoes onto land and began the paddle back toward civilization, David could still hear them echoing in his mind. So hungry, so hungry, so hungry. They reached the Prairie Portage station after dark, paddling by headlamp through water that felt like it was actively resisting their progress. No one spoke during the journey. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like madness. Tom reported the incident to district headquarters, carefully omitting certain details. He spoke of human remains found on an island in Agnes Lake. He mentioned a possible survivalist living in the area who'd threatened the search team. He said Rachel Morrison was deceased, cause of death undetermined, body to be recovered by properly equipped retrieval teams. He didn't mention the transformation, didn't mention Kevin Parr or the other things wearing human shapes, didn't mention the animated skulls or the impossible way the dead refused to be simply dead. "They'll send investigators," Tom said, after he hung up the satellite phone in the station. "FBI, probably. They'll go to the island, document everything, try to make sense of it." He looked at each of them in turn. "And we're going to let them. We're going to give statements about what we saw, factually accurate statements that don't include interpretations or speculation. We found remains. We encountered a disturbed individual. We felt threatened and withdrew. That's the truth." "Is it?" Jennifer's voice was small, hollow. "Is that the truth? Or is it just the acceptable version?" Tom didn't answer. David lay in his cabin that night, unable to sleep. His mind kept returning to Rachel's research notes, to the descriptions of Wendigo Cowan, to the photograph of the symbols carved in trees. The Wendigo wasn't a creature that attacked you. It was a state you entered, A transformation catalyzed by circumstance but rooted in something deeper, in the fundamental human capacity for hunger that went beyond physical need. He thought about Kevin Parr, trapped on the island for 8 months. Had he started out planning to document a story about folklore? Had he laughed at the idea of supernatural monsters? And at what point had isolation and fear, and the simple grinding reality of hunger, begun to change him into something that couldn't die and couldn't be satisfied? David's stomach growled. He'd barely eaten since leaving Agnes Lake, his appetite destroyed by what he'd witnessed. But now, in the darkness, the hunger asserted itself. Simple, biological, demanding. He got up, moved to his kitchen, and assembled a sandwich from the food in his refrigerator. As he ate, he tried to convince himself that the hollow feeling in his chest had nothing to do with what had happened on the island, that it was just hunger, normal human hunger that would be satisfied by normal human food. But Rachel's words haunted him. The Wendigo doesn't possess you. It reveals what you already were. David finished his sandwich. The food hit his stomach and the hunger didn't diminish at all. 3 days later, the FBI retrieval team reached Agnes Lake. They found human remains on the island, the skulls, Rachel's body, scattered bones from dozens of individuals across multiple decades. They documented everything meticulously. They found no trace of living survivors, no shelters, no threatening individuals, no evidence that anyone had been living on the island recently, just bones and the whisper of wind through twisted trees. The official report concluded that Rachel Morrison had suffered a psychotic break triggered by isolation and stress, resulting in self-inflicted injuries that proved fatal. The other remains were attributed to historical indigenous burial practices and natural predation patterns. The investigation was closed. David read the report in his cabin and knew it was a lie, not through malice but through the simple human inability to acknowledge certain kinds of truth. The investigators had seen what they could accept seeing. Everything else had been filtered out by their rational minds, translated into comfortable explanations. He understood. He'd been doing the same thing for 2 weeks, telling himself that the persistent hunger was psychological, that the dreams of walking through forests with Kevin Parr's voice whispering in his ears were just trauma, that the way food no longer satisfied was just depression. But the truth was there in his refrigerator, 3 days' worth of groceries consumed in a single night. It was there in his medical records, unexplained weight loss despite increased caloric intake. It was there in the way he caught himself studying his reflection, looking for the first signs of transformation in his eyes. The island had marked him, not with a curse or possession, nothing so supernatural. It had simply revealed something that had always been there, the capacity for hunger that went beyond need, the void at the center of human consciousness that no amount of consumption could ever truly fill. David returned to work. He filed reports. He maintained trails. He assisted hikers who got lost in the boundary waters. And every night, he lay in his cabin and felt that hollow ache growing, spreading from his stomach into his chest, into the space where his heart beat out a rhythm of want. He thought about returning to Agnes Lake, about taking a canoe and paddling north and letting the island complete what it had started, about joining Kevin and the others in that eternal present where hunger was identity and consumption was the only constant. But he didn't. Not yet. Instead, he ate, and ate, and ate, and felt nothing but the growing emptiness that no amount of food could satisfy, because the Wendigo didn't transform you. It just made you honest about what you'd always been, a creature of hunger, wearing the mask of civilization, pretending that the void could be filled. And now David knew the truth. The void was all there was. The void was all there had ever been. In the boundary waters, winter came early that year. Snow fell in October, and by November the lakes were frozen solid. Rangers reported unusual predation patterns, deer carcasses stripped beyond normal scavenger behavior, moose found gutted with no sign of the predator that killed them. And sometimes, hikers claimed to see a figure moving through the distant trees, tall, thin, lurching with an unnatural gait, always moving north, always heading toward Agnes Lake. David Chen submitted his resignation in December. His supervisor accepted it with concern but without surprise. Everyone knew the search for Rachel Morrison had affected him deeply. He needed time to process, to recover. No one questioned why he planned to spend his final weeks completing a long-term research project in the northern boundary waters, why he packed enough supplies for 2 months, why he requisitioned a canoe and paddled north as the last autumn colors faded to winter gray. And no one was there to see him reach Agnes Lake on the shortest day of the year, when darkness came early and stayed late. No one heard him drag his canoe onto the island's rocky shore, or saw him walk through the bone field to the circle of skulls. No one witnessed his transformation, except the things that were already there, waiting, welcoming him home to the place where hunger was honest and consumption was eternal. In the spring, when the ice melted and the first brave hikers ventured into the deep wilderness, they reported a new addition to the island, a 6th skull in the ceremonial circle, positioned with care, its eye sockets facing north toward the darkest, deepest parts of the forest. The boundary waters remembered, the island remembered, and what it remembered was that some hungers could never be satisfied, only fed. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what David truly became. Christopher Dalton had learned to trust his instincts after 18 years with the National Park Service, and his instincts told him October mornings in the Hoh rainforest were the best part of the job. He filled his thermos with black coffee at 5:47 a.m., exactly 13 minutes before sunrise. The same ritual he'd performed every autumn morning since transferring to Olympic National Park in 2003. The ranger station smelled of cedar and old paper, familiar and grounding. His Garmin eTrex GPS sat charging on the desk beside incident reports he'd already filed. A routine week of lost day hikers and 1 broken ankle on the Hoh River Trail. Nothing he hadn't handled 100 times before. The radio crackled. "Dalton, you copy?" Jenny Reeves, the morning dispatcher, sounded tired. "Copy. What have you got?" "Possible missing person. Female, 23. Didn't check in at Sol Duke yesterday evening. Vehicle still in the Hoh rainforest lot. Hannah Westbrook. Student from UW." Chris pulled on his forest green jacket, already running through protocols in his mind. University of Washington kids came out here every fall, usually prepared, occasionally reckless. Time she was due back? 4 p.m. yesterday. Friend called it in at 9 last night. We waited the standard window. "I'm heading out now. Send me her vehicle description and any trail permits." "Chris?" Jenny's voice shifted, something uncertain creeping in. Her friend mentioned she was doing research, something about immigrant folklore and old-growth forests. Said Hannah was chasing a legend. He grabbed his pack, first aid kit, emergency beacon, rope, the Motorola radio that actually worked in the deep forest where his cell phone became a useless brick of plastic and circuits. They all chase something out here. I'll find her. The October air bit at his face as he drove the 15 miles to the trailhead, the 2-lane road cutting through walls of moss-draped Sitka spruce that had been growing since before Columbus touched the Americas. Dawnlight filtered gray-green through the canopy, turning the world into an aquarium. Chris had always loved this, the weight of the forest, the sense of deep time pressing down through layers of decomposing cedar and hemlock. It made human problems feel temporary, manageable. Hannah Westbrook's car sat alone in the gravel lot, a dented 1998 Honda Civic with a university parking permit and a bumper sticker reading, "Folklore is history's ghost." Chris photographed the vehicle, peered through the windows at scattered papers in the back seat, then shouldered his pack. The trailhead sign indicated 12 miles to the Hoh River Ranger Station, but dozens of smaller paths and game trails spiderwebbed through the temperate rainforest. People wandered off the main trail constantly, drawn by the cathedral quiet and the primordial beauty. He started up the Hall of Moss's trail, boots finding easy rhythm on the soft earth. The forest swallowed sound differently here than in drier woods, everything muffled and close like walking through a green lung. His breath condensed in small clouds, Ferns the size of dinner tables crowded the understory, and Sitka spruce rose like the pillars of a drowned temple, their trunks 8 feet across and disappearing into the canopy fog. At the first junction, Chris stopped to check the GPS. The little screen flickered, 10.2 miles to go, elevation 578 feet. He'd walked these trails enough to navigate by memory, but protocol was protocol. He keyed his radio. "Reeves, I'm at the Hall of Moss's Junction, starting a grid search pattern." Static answered him, then Jenny's voice cutting through the hiss. "Copy that. Weather Service says fog's coming in heavy around noon. Watch yourself." "Always do." But he didn't find Hannah Westbrook on the Hall of Moss's trail, or on the Spruce Nature Trail, or along the river where students sometimes camped illegally. What he found, 3 hours into the search at a GPS reading that placed him 7.4 miles from the trailhead, was something that made him stop walking. A backpack sat in the center of a small clearing, positioned with deliberate precision on a flat stone that protruded from the moss like an altar. Not dropped, not abandoned in panic, placed. The pack was expensive. North Face, dark blue, relatively new. Chris approached it the way he'd approach a sleeping bear, every sense suddenly sharp. The clearing itself felt wrong. The trees formed an almost perfect circle around the open space, their trunks leaning inward at identical angles, as if bowing toward the stone. Chris had never noticed this spot before, though he'd passed through this section of forest a dozen times. The moss grew in strange patterns on the ground, forming shapes that might have been letters in an alphabet he didn't recognize. He photographed everything before touching the pack. Inside, he found a University of Washington student ID, Hannah Westbrook, anthropology major, smiling in the photo with dark hair and earnest eyes. Also in the pack, 3 notebooks filled with dense handwriting, a digital camera, granola bars, a water bottle still half full, and a small digital voice recorder. The notebooks disturbed him more than the careful arrangement. He flipped through pages of sketched symbols and transcribed Slavic words, Leshi, Leshak, Lyasovic, notes about forest spirits from Russian and Ukrainian folklore. A photocopied passage circled in red ink. The Leshi guards the old places. He confuses those who trespass, leading them in circles until they forget which direction is home. Some say he protects the forest. Some say he is the forest. Chris had grown up in logging country, had heard plenty of stories about forests and spirits, but he'd always filed them under the same mental category as Bigfoot sightings, entertaining nonsense people told themselves to make the wilderness more mysterious than it already was. The forest didn't need mythology. It was dangerous enough just being itself. He picked up the voice recorder, pressed play. Hannah's voice emerged, young and excited. October 14th, 11:47 a.m. "I think I've found it. The Grove of the Leshi. Mrs. Kowalski from the Ukrainian Community Center in Seattle told me her grandmother spoke about this place. Slavic immigrants who came to work the timber camps in the 1920s refused to enter certain sections of the forest. They said the Leshi had claimed at first that the trees here were older than the ones in their homeland, and therefore more powerful, more aware." Static, then her voice again. Different now, uncertain. "The trees are arranged in patterns. I'm documenting everything. The GPS keeps glitching, showing my position, jumping around, but I marked my route. I'll be fine." A pause. Forest sounds on the recording. Wind, a raven's call, the whisper of branches. "It's 3:15 p.m. I've been walking for 3 hours, but I keep coming back to the same clearing. That's impossible. I've been following my trail markers, but..." Her breathing quickened. "The markers are moving. I saw one tied on a hemlock 20 minutes ago, and now it's on a different tree. I'm not crazy, I'm not..." The recording dissolved into static, then Hannah's voice, barely a whisper. "The trees are walking. Oh God, they're walking." The recording ended. Chris stood in the clearing with the recorder in his hand, his 18 years of experience suddenly feeling inadequate. He'd found lost hikers in states of hypothermic delirium, had talked down people having psychotic breaks in the wilderness, had seen what fear and exposure could do to human perception. This was that. Had to be. But the backpack's placement, the circular pattern of trees, the moss growing in those strange shapes. He keyed his radio. "Reeves, I found the missing person's gear. Location?" He checked his GPS. The screen flickered, numbers jumping. 7.4 miles from trailhead, then 9.2 miles, then 4.8 miles. He shook the device, checked the battery. Full charge. "My GPS is acting up. I'm marking the location and continuing search. Subject may be disoriented and nearby." "Copy. How's the weather?" Chris looked up. He hadn't noticed the fog rolling in, thick and green-tinted, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet. The temperature had dropped. His watch read 1:17 p.m. "Fog's moving in. I'm going to do a spiral search pattern from this location. Stay in contact. Check in every 30 minutes. "Will do." But the forest had other intentions. Chris marked the clearing with bright orange tape, tied to a massive Sitka spruce whose trunk bore deep grooves, almost like claw marks, running vertically for 15 feet. He photographed the marks, probably just where bears had scratched, and began his search spiral, moving outward in expanding circles, calling Hannah's name every few minutes. The fog thickened, sound dampened to nothing. His boots pressed into moss that felt too soft, too yielding, like walking on living tissue. The trees crowded closer, or seemed to, their branches interlacing overhead until the forest became a tunnel. Chris had spent nearly 2 decades in wilderness, had navigated whiteout blizzards and moonless nights. But this felt different. The forest was doing something to his sense of direction, making every Sitka spruce look identical, every nurse log and fern grove a repetition. After 20 minutes, he stopped to check his GPS again. The screen showed his position as 12.3 miles from the trailhead, but also 3.7 miles, both readings flickering on the display simultaneously. A circle appeared on the map, roughly where he estimated the clearing to be, and then another circle and another, multiplying until the screen showed dozens of overlapping circles spreading across the digital map like ripples in water. He powered the device off and on. The circles remained. "All right," he said aloud, voice swallowed by the fog. "Electronics malfunction. No problem. I know these woods." But did he? He'd turned around from the clearing, or had he? The orange tape marking his starting point was nowhere visible, and he'd only walked 20 minutes. He should be able to see it through the fog. Instead, he saw only trees, fog, moss, and more trees in every direction, identical and indifferent. Chris pulled out his compass. The needle spun lazily, making a full rotation, then another, never settling. He tapped the housing. The needle continued its slow spin, hypnotic and wrong. His heart rate increased. Not panic, not yet, just the adrenaline response of a body recognizing something off in its environment. He was a professional. He'd taught wilderness survival courses. He would not be defeated by fog and malfunctioning equipment. He tried the radio. "Reeves," Dalton checking in. GPS and compass both acting strange, continuing search on foot navigation. Static answered him. Then something that might have been Jenny's voice or might have been the wind in branches, layered and echoing. "Where are you? Where are you? Where?" "Repeat that, Reeves. You're breaking up." More static. Then distinctly a voice that wasn't Jenny's, old, creaking, like wood settling. "You cannot leave. You have entered." Chris's thumb hovered over the transmit button. He hadn't pressed it. The voice had come through on its own. "This is Ranger Dalton requesting radio check," he said clearly, forcing his voice steady. "Dispatch, respond." Nothing. The radio hissed empty static, and underneath it, barely audible, the sound of breathing that wasn't his own. He clipped the radio to his belt, drew in a slow breath and started walking in what his internal sense insisted was west, back toward the trailhead. The fog pressed against his face like cold gauze. Shapes moved in his peripheral vision. Tree trunks, he told himself. Just tree trunks distorted by mist and imagination. But tree trunks didn't breathe, didn't shift position when he wasn't looking directly at them. He'd walked for 40 minutes when he found the clearing again. The same flat stone, the same circle of inward-leaning trees. Hannah's backpack still resting on the altar stone as if he'd never moved it. Impossible. He'd walked in a straight line. Compass be damned. He knew direction by instinct, by the way lichen grew on bark, by the angle of branches. He couldn't have circled back. Yet here it was. Chris picked up the backpack, looked inside. Everything exactly as he'd found it. He checked his own pack. Hannah's ID was still there in his pocket where he'd placed it. So there were two backpacks. Or he'd been walking in circles for 40 minutes and his mind had invented the memory of taking the ID to protect itself from accepting what was happening. He sat down on the stone, made himself think rationally. Disorientation was a known effect of dense fog and repetitive terrain. The GPS malfunction was explainable. Solar flares could disrupt satellite signals. The compass, too, mineral deposits in the rock could create magnetic anomalies. The voice on the radio was probably cross-chatter from another frequency. Everything had a rational explanation, except the trees. He'd marked the massive Sitka spruce with orange tape, tied it on the south-facing side. The tape was now on the north-facing side. He was certain, absolutely certain. He approached the tree, touched the grooves in the bark. They were warm. Living wood shouldn't be warm in October fog. Chris pulled his hand back. His fingers came away tacky, coated with something clear and viscous like sap, but thicker. It smelled of rot and earth and something older, something that made the hindbrain whisper warnings. He wiped his hand on his pants, breathing faster now, and that's when he saw them. Footprints. Fresh human footprints in the moss, leading away from the clearing. Smaller than his boots, Hannah's size. The prints headed north, toward the deeper forest where the Hoh River carved through ancient cedar groves. Relief flooded through him. Physical evidence. A trail to follow. He was back in familiar territory. Search and rescue, tracking, finding the lost. He knew this. Chris followed the prints, moving faster now, calling Hannah's name. The fog thinned slightly, allowing him to see maybe 50 feet ahead. The footprints continued, regular and clear, showing someone walking steadily, not running or stumbling. They led him through nurse logs covered in ferns, past a fallen hemlock whose exposed roots formed a wall 20 feet high, between Sitka spruce trunks so massive that 3 men couldn't link hands around them. The footprints led him for what felt like an hour, though his watch now showed impossible times. 3:47 p.m., then 11:23 a.m., then 6:15 p.m., the digits flickering and changing every time he checked. The footprints led him back to the clearing. The same clearing, the same stone, the same backpack. But now there were 2 sets of footprints, Hannah's smaller tracks and his own larger boot prints, forming a double spiral that circled the stone in an infinite pattern, never quite touching, like a double helix made of trampled moss. Christopher Dalton had 18 years of experience. He had rescued 73 lost hikers. He had recovered 11 bodies. He had never, in all that time, felt what he felt now. The absolute certainty that the forest was playing with him. Something rustled in the trees. Not wind, not an animal. The sound of wood creaking and groaning like old buildings settling, but mobile, moving around the perimeter of the clearing in a slow circle. The trees were drawing closer. He could see it happening if he didn't look directly at them. In his peripheral vision, the Sitka spruce took steps, their root systems pulling from earth and extending like wooden legs, advancing inches at a time. When he turned his head to look straight at them, they were still, solid, immovably planted. But the circle was tighter than before. He was certain of it. "Hannah," his voice cracked. "Hannah Westbrook, if you can hear me, make a sound." Silence. Then, from everywhere and nowhere, a young woman's scream cut short. Chris ran toward the sound, crashed through ferns and over logs, his breath burning in his throat. Branches whipped his face. The fog closed in again, suffocating and complete. He ran for what might have been minutes or hours, his sense of time shattered, running on pure instinct and 18 years of experience that were now worth absolutely nothing. He tripped, fell hard, his hands sinking into moss that felt wrong, too warm, too soft, pulsing slightly like living flesh. When he pushed himself up, his palms left impressions in the moss that slowly filled back in, erasing his touch. He was in a new clearing, larger than the first. The trees here were older, impossibly old, their trunks wide as houses. In the center stood a structure made of twisted branches and moss, shaped like a doorway, but leading to nothing, just more forest beyond. Symbols marked the frame, carved deep into the wood, the same symbols from Hannah's notebooks. Slavic characters spelling out warnings or invitations, he couldn't tell which. And beside the doorway, arranged in a careful pattern, were objects. A hiking boot, child-sized. A pocket watch, stopped at 3:47 p.m. A flannel shirt rotted to fragments. A femur bone, old and moss-covered. A tin cup rusted through. More items, dozens of them, extending in a spiral around the doorway. Artifacts of people who'd entered the forest and never left, spanning decades, maybe a century. At the end of the spiral, fresh and new, sat Hannah's digital camera. Chris picked it up with shaking hands, powered it on. The battery was full. The screen showed a series of photos, the last ones time-stamped at 4:23 p.m. yesterday. He scrolled through them. Photos of the forest, normal trees and moss. Then photos of trees that seemed to have faces in their bark. Then photos where the faces were clearer, watching the camera. Then a photo of the branch doorway taken from the other side, looking back toward where Chris now stood. The next photo showed a figure standing in the doorway, tall, impossibly tall, made of bark and branch and root, with eyes like knotholes and a mouth like a wound in heartwood. The Leshy, the forest guardian. The thing that Slavic immigrants had brought with them in stories or had found waiting here in older trees than their homeland had ever known. The last photo was Hannah's face, a selfie, tears streaming, her mouth open in a scream, and behind her, the Leshy's wooden hand resting on her shoulder. Chris dropped the camera. "I'm sorry." The words came out unbidden. "I'm sorry for intruding. I'm looking for Hannah Westbrook, please. I just want to find her and leave." The trees groaned, a chorus of creaking wood that might have been laughter, or might have been something far older than human emotion. The fog swirled, and in it he saw shapes, dozens of shapes standing between the trees, formed from bark and moss and shadow. The lost ones. People who'd wandered too deep, stayed too long, disrespected the old places. One of the shapes moved closer, female or had been. Her face was smooth wood now, her hair trailing moss, her body halfway between human and tree. She raised one hand, and he saw Hannah's bracelet on her wrist, a silver chain with a tiny compass charm. "Hannah?" His voice was barely a whisper. The Hannah thing tilted her head, and when she opened her mouth, beetles crawled out instead of words. She pointed behind him. Chris turned. The Leshy stood in the branch doorway, 8 feet tall, its body a twisted mass of Sitka spruce and cedar, its face ancient and patient and utterly devoid of anything he could reason with. It raised one arm, and the trees around the clearing groaned and shifted, tightening the circle. "You cannot leave," it said, voice like 1,000 branches breaking in wind. "You have entered. The forest remembers." Chris's mind raced through possibilities. His radio was dead, his GPS useless, his compass spinning. He had no weapon that could fight this, no experience that prepared him for this. 18 years meant nothing. All his competence, all his confidence, all his certainty about understanding these woods, stripped away in hours. He thought of Hannah's notebook, the photocopied passage. Some say he protects the forest. Some say he is the forest. "I respect the forest," Chris said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. "I've protected it for 18 years. I enforce the rules. I keep people safe." The Leshy moved closer, its feet making no sound on the moss. "You enforce your rules, not ours. The forest was here before your paths, before your signs, before your maps that claim to show what cannot be shown. You walk through the old places and believe you understand them. You do not. Then teach me." Let me learn. Let me... He swallowed. Let me go, and I'll make sure others respect. You still do not understand. The Leshy's wooden face leaned close, Knothole's eyes seeing through him. There is no leaving, there is only choosing. Stay and become part of the forest like the others. Or what? Walk through the doorway, return to your world. But you will carry us with you. You will remember that your confidence was false, that your competence was illusion, that the wilderness you believed you mastered was merely tolerating your presence. You will never trust your instincts again. You will doubt every tree, every shadow, every moment of certainty. You will live, but you will never be whole. The choice wasn't really a choice. Chris looked at the Hannah thing, at the other lost ones, at the spiral of artifacts from a century of disappearances. I'll walk through, he said. The Leshy stepped aside. Chris approached the branched doorway, every muscle trembling. Behind him, the lost ones watched with wooden eyes. The fog pressed in from all sides. He could feel the forest's attention on him, vast and ancient and patient. He stepped through the doorway. The dispatcher found him at 7:47 a.m. on October 16th, sitting on the ground at the Hall of Moss's trailhead parking lot, exactly where Hannah Westbrook's Honda Civic sat alone. He was covered in moss and soil, his GPS smashed, his compass bent. He was holding Hannah's student ID in one hand and her voice recorder in the other. When they asked him what happened, he could only say he'd gotten lost. When they asked about Hannah Westbrook, he said he couldn't find her. When they asked why he'd been gone for 31 hours when his last radio contact had been 4 hours ago, he had no answer. They found Hannah's backpack in the clearing exactly where Chris had reported it. They found her camera. They found her notebooks. They never found Hannah. The official report listed her as missing, presumed dead, cause unknown. The unofficial whispers in the ranger station were about Chris Dalton's mental break, about how the best of them could snap under the isolation and pressure. Chris turned in his resignation 3 weeks later. He couldn't patrol the trails anymore, couldn't trust that the trees were in the same places he remembered, couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching him, waiting to see if he'd tell anyone the truth. He never did tell. Who would believe him? He barely believed himself. But on October nights, when the fog rolls through Olympic National Park and the old Sitka spruce groan in wind that isn't blowing, Christopher Dalton sits in his apartment in Seattle and listens to Hannah's voice recorder, played low so his neighbors won't hear. October 14th, 11:47 a.m. I think I've found it, the grove of the Leshy. And underneath her voice, if he turns the volume up high enough, he can hear something else. The sound of trees walking, the creak of ancient wood, the breathing of a forest that was here before maps, before names, before humans believed they could understand it. The Leshy keeps its promises. Chris lives, but he is not whole. And sometimes, in the deepest part of night, he wonders if he actually walked through that doorway at all, or if he's still in the clearing, still circling the stone, slowly transforming into wood and moss and memory, while the forest patiently waits for him to realize the truth. The compass on his desk, a new one, expensive and supposedly reliable, spins lazily in no particular direction, never settling, never still. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Chris. Did he really escape? Daniel Carter had spent the better part of 3 hours cross-referencing incident reports when the pattern first emerged from the spreadsheet like a face forming in static. 4 disappearances. Same general area. Same time of year. Always late October. Always within a 7-day window. The earliest dated back to 1984. The most recent was 6 days ago. Lauren Mitchell, 27, experienced backpacker, last seen on the Cascade Pass Trail in North Cascades National Park. He leaned back in his chair at the ranger station, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and rubbed his eyes. The logical part of his brain, the part that had earned him a degree in forestry management and a reputation as the guy who solved problems with data rather than gut instinct, told him this was confirmation bias. He was looking for patterns because a young woman was missing and he needed something to grasp onto. People disappeared in the wilderness. It happened. Usually they turned up dehydrated, injured, or embarrassingly lost. Sometimes they didn't turn up at all. But 4 people over 30 years, all in the same 5-mile radius, all during the same week in October? Daniel pulled up the digital topographical map on his aging desktop computer. The cursor hovered over the confluence of Cascade Pass Trail and the route leading up towards Sahale Glacier Camp. Elevation 5,400 feet at the pass itself, climbing to 7,600 feet at the glacier. Steep terrain, crevasses, weather that could turn from clear to whiteout in 20 minutes. He'd worked North Cascades for 8 years now, and he knew that stretch of wilderness could kill you in a dozen different ways without breaking a sweat. His phone buzzed. Text from Ranger Sarah Mendez, who was coordinating the search for Lauren Mitchell. Any luck with those old reports? Daniel typed back. Found something. Need to show you. The station door opened, bringing a gust of October wind that smelled like pine and approaching rain. Sarah walked in, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, her face showing the exhaustion of 3 days spent organizing search parties. She was 10 years younger than Daniel's 41, but she'd grown up in these mountains and knew them with an intimacy that his spreadsheets could never capture. "Please tell me you have good news," she said, shaking raindrops from her jacket. Daniel turned the monitor toward her. "Define good. Lauren Mitchell isn't the first person to vanish from that area. 3 others, spread over 3 decades. October 1984, Thomas Brennan, solo hiker. October 1997, Elise Corman, part of a climbing group, separated from her party. October 2006, David Chen, trail runner." Sarah frowned, leaning in to study the map. "That's unusual, but Daniel, we get disappearances, you know that." "Same week, Sarah, October 23rd through 29th. Every single time. Brennan was found 2 weeks later at the base of a crevasse. Cause of death was listed as exposure and trauma from the fall, but the medical examiner noted unusual blood loss inconsistent with visible injuries. Corman was never found. Chen turned up 11 months later near Doubtful Lake, 3 miles from where he disappeared. His body was, the report says, desiccated, like he'd been in a desert instead of a temperate rainforest. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her pragmatic mind working through the data. "What are you thinking? Serial killer operating on a schedule?" "I don't know what I'm thinking. That's the problem." Daniel pulled up another file. Lauren's boyfriend reported her missing when she didn't return from a 3-day solo backpacking trip. She's experienced, well-equipped. She filed a wilderness permit. Planned route was Cascade Pass Trail up to Sahale Glacier Camp, then back down. Should have taken her 2.5 days maximum. It's been 6. "Search teams have been over that whole area," Sarah said. "We found her tent at the glacier camp exactly where she'd planned to set up. Sleeping bag was inside. Her food was properly stored in a bear canister. Nothing disturbed. But no Lauren." Daniel minimized the map and pulled up a scanned image from the 1984 case file. This is from Thomas Brennan's incident. The rangers who found him said something about his campsite. He read from the typed report. Subject's tent and belongings appeared undisturbed. Sleeping bag was still inside tent. Food stores intact. However, subject's boots were found approximately 300 yards from campsite, arranged in parallel, facing northeast. Arrangement appeared deliberate. The fluorescent lights flickered, and both rangers glanced up reflexively. When Daniel looked back at Sarah, he saw that her expression had changed. "We found Lauren's boots," she said quietly. "Yesterday, about a quarter mile from her tent. I didn't mention it in the main briefing because it seemed, I don't know, strange. They were side by side, laces tied, pointing uphill toward the glacier. The humming of the lights suddenly seemed louder. Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest, not fear exactly, but recognition. The pattern was asserting itself with uncomfortable clarity. "I need to go up there," he said. "Daniel, we have teams." I need to see it myself. The campsite where the boots were found, the terrain. There's something in the historical data I'm missing, and I can't find it from here. He was already pulling out his topographical map, the paper version he preferred for field work. His fingers traced the elevation lines, the blue threads of glacial streams, the tight clusters that indicated steep drops. Sarah crossed her arms. You're not going alone. Especially not with weather moving in. Noah is calling for a storm system tomorrow night. Then I go tomorrow morning, get up there, look around, and get back before the storm hits. 12 hours max. Daniel met her eyes. Sarah, I know how this sounds. I know I'm the guy who trusts data over intuition. But the data is telling me something's wrong up there. Really wrong. She studied him for a long moment, then sighed. Okay. But you take a radio, a GPS beacon, and you check in every 2 hours. And Daniel? If you're not back by 1800 hours, I'm sending a team after you, storm or no storm. Daniel nodded, already making mental notes about gear. His Garmin GPS map 62s was reliable, though GPS could be spotty in the deep valleys. He'd bring his Motorola T600 radio, backup batteries, his well-worn mountain hardware pack. He'd done this route a dozen times in various seasons. He knew its moods. What he didn't know was why 4 people had vanished from the same small area of wilderness, or why their belongings had been left behind in ways that suggested careful arrangement rather than panicked flight. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table in his small cabin on the edge of the park, unable to sleep. He'd printed out all 4 case files and spread them across the worn wood surface. His laptop was open to a browser window where he'd been searching for any historical context that might explain the pattern. Accidents clustered around dangerous terrain. That made sense. But this wasn't about the terrain. This was about the calendar. October 23rd through 29th. He pulled up a calendar algorithm and calculated backwards. In 1984, October 23rd was a Tuesday. In 1997, it was a Thursday. 2006 was a Monday. This year, 2014, October 23rd had been a Thursday. Lauren Mitchell had started her hike on October 24th. She should have been back on the 26th. Today was October 28th. Daniel's fingers hovered over the keyboard, then typed, North Cascades Historical Deaths, 1900-1950. The search results were sparse. Digitization of old records was incomplete. But one result caught his eye. A scanned newspaper article from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, dated November 2, 1910. Immigrant worker found dead in Cascades. Foul play suspected. Daniel clicked through, squinting at the century-old text. The body of Nicolae Russo, 34, an immigrant laborer from Romania, was discovered yesterday near Cascade Pass by a hunting party. Mr. Russo had been working on trail maintenance for the U.S. Forest Service. According to authorities, Russo died of exposure, but the condition of his body has raised questions. Never seen anything like it, stated Sheriff William Garrett. Body was drained of color, like something had drawn the life right out of him. Several workers report that Russo had complained of feeling watched in the weeks before his death and had become increasingly agitated. He claimed that he was being haunted by something from the old country. The sheriff's office is interviewing several workers who had disputes with Russo prior to his death. The article continued with speculation about murder versus misadventure, but Daniel had stopped reading. His academic mind immediately tried to rationalize. Coincidence? Historical curiosity? Nothing to do with present-day disappearances, but something else. Some instinct he didn't trust and couldn't name was screaming at him. He searched for more information about Nicolae Russo but found nothing. The case apparently went cold. An immigrant worker's suspicious death in 1910 wouldn't have warranted much investigation. Daniel closed the laptop and stared at the case files. Lauren Mitchell smiled out from her permit photo. Blonde hair, confident expression, the kind of person who belonged in wild places. He would find her, or at least find out what happened to her. That was his job. That was what the data and the patterns and the careful analysis were for. But as he finally climbed into bed at 2 a.m., Daniel couldn't shake the phrase from that old newspaper article, like something had drawn the life right out of him. The alarm went off at 5:30 a.m. Daniel dressed in layers, base wicking layer, fleece, waterproof shell. The weather was holding for now, but the pressure was dropping. He could feel it in his sinuses, that pre-storm sensation. He packed his gear with methodical precision. Headlamp, backup batteries, water filtration system, emergency bivvy, first aid kit, food for 2 days even though he planned to be back tonight. His Garmin GPS went into his chest pocket, the Motorola radio into an outer pocket of his pack. At the ranger station, Sarah was already there, looking like she hadn't slept much either. Forecast got worse, she said by way of greeting. Storm's moving faster than expected. You've got until 1600 hours, then you need to be heading down. Doesn't matter what you've found. Understood. Daniel signed out, noting his planned route and expected return time. Official protocol, the kind of thing that helped search teams find you if things went wrong. The drive to the Cascade Pass trailhead took 40 minutes on the winding mountain road. The parking area was empty except for 2 cars, Lauren's red Subaru Outback and one other vehicle, probably belonging to the search team that had been staying at the high camp. Daniel parked, did a final check of his gear, and started up the trail. The forest closed around him with familiar comfort. Douglas fir and western hemlock rose like cathedral pillars, their bark dark with morning dew. The trail climbed steadily, switchbacking up the mountainside. Daniel had good legs and a sustainable pace. He could cover 3 miles an hour on terrain like this. The pass was 3.7 miles from the trailhead. Sahali Glacier Camp was another 2 miles and 2,200 feet of elevation gain beyond that. He'd been hiking for 90 minutes when he noticed the silence. Daniel stopped, his breath misting in the cold air. The absence of sound was absolute. No birds, no wind in the trees, no distant rustle of small mammals in the undergrowth, just his breathing and the muffled thud of his heartbeat in his ears. He'd experienced this before, usually right before major weather events when animals hunkered down and waited out the storm. But the sky above the canopy was still clear, and the storm wasn't supposed to arrive for hours yet. Daniel pulled out his radio. "Station, this is Carter. Radio check." Static, then Sarah's voice. "Copy, Carter. You're coming through. Status?" "About 2 miles in, making good time. Weird atmospheric conditions up here, though. Really quiet." "Copy that. Keep me posted. Next check-in at 0930. Daniel continued climbing. The silence persisted, oppressive and unnatural. When he finally emerged above the tree line at Cascade Pass, he was almost relieved, until he saw the view. The pass itself was a saddle between peaks, offering panoramic views of the surrounding mountains. To the north, Mount Johannesburg loomed, its glaciers gleaming in the morning sun. To the south, the trail dropped away into the Stehekin Valley, and directly ahead, rising like a frozen wave, was Sahali Mountain, its glacier spilling down the upper slopes. Beautiful, indifferent, deadly if you didn't respect it. Daniel checked his GPS. Elevation 5,123 feet. He still had 2 more miles and 2,200 feet to climb to reach the camp where Lauren's tent had been found. He started up the steep climber's trail, his poles biting into the rocky soil. The silence followed him. An hour later, he reached Sahali Glacier Camp. The site was exactly as described in the reports. A flat area of rock and sparse vegetation at the edge of the glacier, maybe 50 yards across. Lauren's blue tent still stood there, its fly secured against wind. The search team's larger expedition tent was nearby, but the team itself had descended yesterday to resupply. Daniel approached Lauren's tent slowly, noting details. No tears in the fabric. Zippers closed. He opened the entrance and peered inside. The sleeping bag was there, still partially unzipped as if someone had just gotten out of it. A book, some thriller with a lurid cover, lay face down beside the sleeping pad. A headlamp hung from the tent's ceiling loop. Everything normal. Everything suggesting she'd simply stepped outside and would be back momentarily. Except she'd been gone for 6 days. Daniel photographed everything with his phone, then straightened and looked around the campsite. The search team had marked off areas with small flags where they'd found evidence. There, about 200 yards uphill toward the glacier, was a cluster of flags, He hiked over, his boots crunching on the rocky ground. The flags marked a small area where Lauren's hiking boots had been found. Daniel crouched down, examining the ground. The boots were gone now, taken as evidence, but he could see the impressions in the thin soil where they'd rested. Side by side, perfectly parallel, laces tied, facing northeast toward the glacier, the same direction Thomas Brennan's boots had been pointing in 1984. Daniel stood and looked in that direction. The glacier rose above him, its surface a maze of crevasses and seracs, blue ice exposed where snow had melted. Dangerous terrain. Technically, you weren't supposed to go onto the glacier without proper equipment. Crampons, ice axes, rope, training. But people did it anyway, and sometimes they fell into hidden crevasses and were never found. Was that the answer? Had all 4 victims ventured onto the glacier and fallen to their deaths? But then who had arranged their boots? And why? Daniel pulled out his radio. "Station, this is Carter. I'm at the camp. Everything appears consistent with reports. No sign of Mitchell. Copy. Any theories?" "Working on it. Need more time to look around." 1930 hours, Daniel. That's your hard deadline." "Understood." He clicked off the radio and stood in the silence, thinking. His analytical mind wanted to organize the evidence into a coherent narrative, but the pieces didn't fit standard patterns. In his 8 years as a ranger, he'd seen people die from exposure, falls, avalanches, and their own poor decisions. He'd seen bodies recovered from impossible places, carried away by families who would never fully understand why their loved one had died. He'd seen enough death to know that nature didn't need a motive or a pattern. Nature just was, and sometimes people got in the way. But this wasn't nature. This was something else, something deliberate. The temperature was dropping, and the quality of light had changed. Daniel looked up and saw clouds building to the west, advancing faster than the forecast predicted. The storm was coming early. He needed to make a decision. Head down now to stay ahead of the weather, or continue the investigation and risk getting caught in a blizzard at 7,600 feet. The analytical part of him said go down. The other part, the part that had been growing louder since he'd read about Nikolai Russo, said there was something here he needed to find. Daniel started walking toward the glacier. The transition from rock to ice was gradual, areas of dirty snow giving way to harder, cleaner ice. Without crampons, Daniel stayed on the edges, avoiding the obvious crevasses that split the glacier's surface like wounds. The terrain rose steeply and he used his trekking poles for balance, testing each step. He was maybe 100 yards onto the glacier when he found the first marker. It was a cairn, a small stack of rocks, the kind hikers sometimes built to mark trails or memorialize visits. Except this one was different. The rocks were arranged in a specific pattern, almost like a spiral, and there was something woven between the stones. Thin strips of what looked like leather or maybe dried plant matter, dark with age. Daniel photographed it, then looked around. There, another cairn, 50 yards further up the glacier, and another beyond that. They formed a path leading up toward the higher ice. This wasn't random. Someone had built these deliberately, though the weathering suggested they'd been here for years, maybe decades. Against his better judgment, Daniel followed them. The third cairn was larger, more elaborate. As Daniel approached, he noticed there were objects embedded in the rock pile. He crouched down, pulling out his phone to use its flashlight for a closer look. A tarnished silver medallion on a chain, religious imagery, Christian but not a style he recognized. Eastern Orthodox, maybe. He photographed it without touching it. A small leather pouch, cracked and stiff with age. He carefully opened it and found what looked like dried herbs and a slip of paper with faded writing. The language wasn't English. Romanian. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. Nikolai Russo had been Romanian. The fourth cairn had more objects. A knife with a wooden handle, the blade dark with rust. More leather pouches. A glass bottle, empty with traces of some dark residue inside. And bones, small animal bones, arranged in patterns Daniel didn't understand. This wasn't memorial. This was ritual. He stood, looking up at the glacier. The cairns continued, leading higher into the ice. The clouds were much closer now, and the wind was picking up, carrying the sharp, cold smell of approaching snow. Every rational instinct told him to turn back. Instead, he kept climbing. The fifth cairn was the largest. It stood nearly 3 feet tall, built with stones that must have taken considerable effort to haul up here. The rocks were covered in markings, symbols scratched or painted onto their surfaces. Daniel recognized some of them from his late-night internet research. Protective sigils, wards against evil, crosses mixed with older symbols that predated Christianity, and there, woven into the top of the cairn like a crown, was a circle made of twisted wire and what looked like human hair, blackened with age. Daniel's hands were shaking as he photographed it. Not from cold, from the understanding that was crystallizing in his mind, hard and terrible and impossible. Nikolai Russo hadn't died of exposure in 1910. He'd built these cairns as protection against something, and he'd died anyway. The wind gusted, sharp enough to make Daniel stagger. He looked back down the glacier and saw that the camp was now obscured by blowing snow. The storm had arrived. "Shit," he muttered, pulling his hood up. He needed to get off this glacier immediately. But as he turned to descend, something caught his eye. Movement, higher on the ice. A figure. Daniel's heart jumped. "Lauren?" he shouted, his voice swallowed by the wind. "Lauren Mitchell?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, perhaps 200 yards away, motionless against the white backdrop of the glacier. Too far to make out details, but definitely human-shaped. Daniel pulled out his radio, but his cold fingers fumbled it. The device slipped from his grip, bounced once on the ice, and disappeared into a narrow crevasse. No. He dropped to his knees, trying to see into the crack, but it was too deep and too dark. The radio was gone. When he looked up again, the figure was closer, maybe 100 yards now. It had moved in absolute silence, crossing terrain that should have taken minutes, in what felt like seconds. Daniel's analytical mind tried to explain it. Distance perception was unreliable in this environment, especially in blowing snow. Adrenaline distorted time perception. The figure had probably just been closer than he'd initially thought, but he knew, with sick certainty, that he was lying to himself. The figure moved again, and this time Daniel definitely saw it. A smooth, gliding motion that didn't match human locomotion. It was closer now, close enough that he could see it was wearing dark clothing, close enough that he could see it had pale skin, close enough that he could see it had no face. No, that wasn't right. It had a face, but the features were wrong. Sunken, desiccated, like something that had been left in a desert for years, but the eyes were bright, fever bright, and they were fixed on Daniel. Every instinct screamed at him to run. Daniel turned and scrambled down the glacier, moving as fast as he dared on the ice. His trekking poles clattered against the frozen surface. Behind him he heard nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no pursuit. But he felt it anyway. A cold pressure against his back like a physical thing. He reached the fourth cairn, then the third, moving down the path marked by those ancient protective wards. The camp came into view through the swirling snow. If he could just reach it, something grabbed his ankle. Daniel went down hard, his chin striking ice. Stars exploded across his vision. He rolled onto his back and saw it crouched over him. The thing that had been a human being once, maybe many years ago, maybe just days. Its skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over bones. Its mouth opened, revealing teeth that were too long, too sharp, filed or grown into points. When it spoke, the voice was dry as wind through dead leaves. Carter. It knew his name. Daniel tried to scream, but couldn't find his breath. The thing leaned closer, and he smelled earth and rot and something else. Something that reminded him of the inside of very old churches. "You came looking," it whispered. They always come looking. Then it was gone, dissolved into the swirling snow, and Daniel was alone on the ice. He didn't remember standing or moving. But suddenly he was running, staggering through the storm toward the camp. He reached Lauren's tent and threw himself inside, zipping it closed with shaking hands. His breath came in ragged gasps. His chin was bleeding where he'd hit the ice. His GPS was still in his pocket, but his radio was gone, and his phone showed no signal. Daniel pressed his back against the tent wall and tried to think, tried to process what he'd just seen with his rational, analytical mind. Hypothermia could cause hallucinations. So could altitude sickness, though 7,600 feet wasn't usually high enough. Dehydration, stress, fear. The brain, under extreme conditions, could create incredibly vivid hallucinations that seemed real. Except it had known his name. The wind howled outside, shaking the tent. Snow built up against the fabric. Daniel knew he was trapped. No way down in this storm. He'd have to wait it out, hope it passed before nightfall. Then he could descend using his GPS, make it back to the trailhead, report what? That he'd seen a dead person walking on a glacier? That he'd found evidence of occult rituals a century old? That 4 people had vanished because something impossible was hunting them? Sarah would think he'd had a breakdown. Hell, maybe he had. Daniel forced himself to breathe slowly, to think logically. He needed data, evidence, something concrete. He unzipped the tent partially and peered out. The storm was intensifying, but in the brief moments between gusts, he could see the glacier, empty now, just white ice and blowing snow. No figures, no impossibilities. He zipped the tent closed again and turned to survey his temporary shelter. Lauren's sleeping bag, her book, her belongings left behind as if she'd just stepped out. Daniel froze. The sleeping bag was different. He'd seen it when he first entered. A red mummy bag, partially unzipped. Now it was fully zipped closed, and the shape inside suggested it was occupied. Lauren? His voice came out as a whisper. The shape in the sleeping bag didn't move. Daniel reached out with one shaking hand and touched the fabric. It was cold, not body warm, but ice cold. He found the zipper and slowly pulled it down. The face that emerged wasn't Lauren Mitchell's. It belonged to a young man, Asian features, skin with that same terrible parchment dryness. David Chen, who had disappeared in 2006 and been found 11 months later, desiccated. Except he was here now, in Lauren's sleeping bag, and his eyes were opening. Daniel scrambled backward, hitting the tent wall. Chen sat up with a movement that was too smooth, too controlled. His mouth opened, and that dry leaf voice emerged. She's with us now. They're all with us. What are you? Daniel managed. Strigoi. The word was Romanian, and Chen pronounced it with an accent that definitely wasn't his own. The one you've been reading about, Nicolae Russo. He tried to warn them, tried to protect this place, but they wouldn't listen. They thought he was crazy, superstitious. So he died here, and his anger remained, his hunger remained. That's not possible. This isn't real. You've seen the data, Daniel Carter. The analyst, the rational man. 4 people in 30 years. Always October, always the same week. Chen's head tilted at an angle that human necks shouldn't bend. Do you know why that week? Daniel shook his head, unable to speak. Because that's when Nicolae Russo died, October 25th, 1910. They left him to freeze on this glacier, the workers who hated him for being different, for speaking of old country fears they mocked. And as he died, as the cold took him, he called on old protections, old curses, the kind his grandmother taught him in the Carpathian Mountains. Vampires aren't real, Daniel said, but the word sounded hollow even to him. Not vampires. Strigoi. Different thing. We were dead, but we return. We hunger, but not for blood alone. We take life itself. Energy, warmth, the very essence that makes you you. Chen's desiccated face twisted into something that might have been a smile. Nicolae became what he feared, and now, during the week of his death, the boundary thins. He can reach out. He can take what was taken from him. Lauren Mitchell. is walking in the snow. Her body moves, but she is not driving it anymore. In a few days, the week will end. The boundary will thicken again. She'll collapse somewhere on this mountain, and when they find her months or years from now, they'll say it was exposure. Just like they said about David Chen, about Thomas Brennan. Daniel's hand found his pocket, closed around a emergency flare gun he'd packed. Not much of a weapon, but it was something. And Elise Corman? They never found her body. Oh, they did. Chen gestured toward the tent's entrance. She's the one you saw on the glacier. She's been here longest. She's almost completely his now. The tent entrance unzipped from outside, moved by no visible hand. Snow swirled in, and with it came the figure Daniel had seen before. Elise Corman, or what remained of her. A woman in her 40s wearing clothing from 1997. Her skin mummified, her eyes burning with that terrible fever light. Behind her was another figure, younger, blonde, wearing modern hiking gear, Lauren Mitchell. Daniel pulled the flare gun and fired in a single desperate motion. The projectile streaked past Lauren, missing her by inches, and struck the glacier beyond. It exploded in brilliant red fire, burning impossibly bright against the storm. All three figures recoiled from the light, their movement sudden and inhuman. Daniel used the moment to burst from the tent, running blindly into the storm. He had no plan, no destination, just pure animal panic driving him. He made it maybe 50 yards before he realized he was running uphill, back onto the glacier. Wrong direction. He needed to go down, back to the trailhead, to people and rationality and help. But when he turned, all three figures were behind him, arranged in a line blocking his path down. They didn't run. They didn't need to. They were patient. They'd been patient for years. Daniel backed away, his boots slipping on ice. The figures advanced. Behind them, more shapes were emerging from the storm. Thomas Brennan in his 1980s hiking gear. Others Daniel didn't recognize. Older disappearances, maybe, from before anyone bothered keeping records. And in the center of them all, more solid than the rest, a dark-haired man in primitive work clothes from a century ago, Nikolai Russo. When he spoke, all the other mouths moved with his, creating a chorus of dry voices. "You're a smart man, Daniel Carter, an analyst. You like patterns. Here's a pattern. Every 30 years, give or take, someone comes looking. Someone like you, who won't accept simple answers. And every time, we grow stronger." Another voice, another set of hands. Daniel's heel hit a crack in the ice, a crevasse edge. One more step and he'd fall into unknown depths. He teetered there, caught between the frozen dead and the frozen abyss. "There's a choice," Nikolai said. "There's always a choice. You can fall into the ice, die clean. They'll find your body eventually, say it was an accident, or you can join us, feed us, become the bait for the next curious one." "That's not a choice," Daniel said. His voice was steadier than he felt. "That's two different deaths." "Yes," Nikolai agreed, "but one has purpose." Daniel thought of the cairns on the glacier, Nikolai's desperate attempt to protect or contain what he was becoming. He thought of the old newspaper article. He claimed that he was being haunted by something from the old country. Nikolai hadn't become a monster by choice. He'd died afraid and angry, and had been twisted into something terrible. "You can't leave this glacier," Daniel said, making connections. "That's why Lauren's tent is still here, why all their belongings are arranged. You can only take people during that specific week, and even then you can't leave this specific area. Nikolai's death bound you here." The figures stopped advancing. Nikolai's eyes, burning in that desiccated face, narrowed. "The cairns," Daniel continued, his analyst mind working frantically. "They're not just memorials. They're boundaries, a protective circle. You built them yourself, Nikolai, before you died, trying to contain what you were becoming. And it worked. You're trapped inside your own ward." "Smart," Nikolai hissed. "So smart. And what does that knowledge gain you? You're still here, still inside the circle. Maybe. But you need me to choose. You can't just take me. There has to be consent, even if it's forced. That's part of the old rules, isn't it? The Strigoi rules. Daniel didn't know if he was right, but he'd done enough late-night research to know that folklore monsters often had rules. Vampires needed invitations. Fae couldn't lie. Strigoi needed their victims to, on some level, give up. "I don't give up," Daniel said. "I don't consent, and I'm not jumping into that crevasse." "Then you'll die of exposure," Nikolai said. "Slowly. Painfully. We can wait. The storm will last hours. By nightfall, you'll be hypothermic. You'll make mistakes. You'll fall. Or you'll sleep. And when you sleep, I won't be inside the circle anymore when I die," Daniel said. "The storm will push me past the boundary. And if I die outside the circle, you can't take me." It was a bluff. He had no idea if the boundary extended vertically, if the storm would blow him far enough, if any of this folklore logic actually applied to his situation. But Nikolai's reaction told him he'd hit something close to truth. The figure of Nikolai Russo flickered, losing solidity. The other shapes, Lauren, Elise, David, Thomas, began to fade as well, like images on dying screens. "Every year I get smarter," Nikolai's voice came, distant now. "Every victim adds to me. Every curious analyst like you teaches me new tricks. One day I'll figure out how to break my own ward. One day I'll walk down this mountain, and then..." The voice faded. The figures dissolved into snow. Daniel was alone on the glacier. He stood there for a long moment, shaking with cold and terror before he forced himself to move. Down. He needed to go down. The GPS in his pocket would guide him. The storm wouldn't last forever. 1 foot in front of the other. That's all. Just movement. Just survival. Daniel made it off the glacier as full darkness fell. The storm eased as he descended, and by the time he reached the pass, he could see stars between breaking clouds. His phone found signal around 6,000 feet, and he called the ranger station. Sarah's voice was sharp with relief and anger. "Daniel, where the hell?" "Send a team," he said. His voice sounded strange, distant. "I need extraction, and Sarah. Close the Cascade Pass Trail. Close it for the week of October 23rd through 29th. Every year. Make it official. Avalanche danger, rockfall, whatever reason works. But close it." "Daniel, what happened up there?" "I'll tell you in person. Most of it. Some of it you won't believe." He looked back up at the mountain, at the glacier gleaming under starlight. "But close the trail. Please. Trust me on this." He made it to the trailhead at 3 a.m., where Sarah and a search team met him with thermal blankets and hot coffee and 100 questions. They found Lauren Mitchell's body 3 days later, at the base of a crevasse. Cause of death: exposure and trauma from a fall. Just like Thomas Brennan in 1984. The medical examiner noted unusual blood loss but attributed it to the fallen scavengers. Daniel wrote up his report, careful and clinical. He noted the dangerous conditions, the inadequate weather forecasting, the difficulty of the terrain. He recommended seasonal closures of the upper trail. He didn't mention Nikolai Russo or Strigoi or the burning eyes of the dead. North Cascades National Park implemented his recommendations. For the week of October 23rd through October 29th every year, the Cascade Pass Trail beyond the pass itself is closed to the public. The official reason is avalanche danger. Nobody has disappeared from that area since 2014. Daniel Carter still works as a ranger, still analyzes data and solves problems with logic and careful thought. But there are some reports he keeps in a locked drawer in his office, some patterns he's noticed but doesn't share. Other wilderness areas, other specific weeks, other disappearances that don't quite add up. Sometimes on October nights he dreams of ice and dead eyes and a voice like wind through graves. In the dreams, Nikolai Russo speaks in a chorus of stolen voices, teaching him things Daniel doesn't want to know. And sometimes when Daniel reviews missing persons cases from wilderness areas, he finds himself calculating patterns, looking for weeks and coordinates that repeat. He finds them more often than he'd like. There are things in the wild places Daniel knows now. Things that were human once maybe, or were never human at all. Things that hunger, things that wait. Things that are trapped by their own desperate protections, but are very, very patient. The data is there if you know how to look for it, if you're analyst enough to see the pattern. Daniel sees them, and every time he closes a trail, recommends a seasonal restriction, diverts hikers from specific areas during specific weeks, he's fighting a silent war against impossibilities he can't acknowledge. Because the dead don't just rest in the wilderness. Sometimes they wait. Sometimes they learn. And somewhere on a glacier in the North Cascades, Nikolai Russo is still learning, still growing stronger with each October that passes. One day, Daniel knows, the old boundaries will fail. One day the ward will break. But not yet. Not on his watch. Daniel closes his laptop, files away another report recommending a closure, and stares out at the mountains beyond his office window. Beautiful, indifferent, deadly, and patient. So very patient. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what really happened to Daniel on that glacier.